Hello, welcome back for episode 2 of Recruit and Relax. Now, I know I said that this episode was going to encompass coffee chats, resume walkthroughs, and star stories, but like many things in business, I'm going to pivot that a little bit. Instead, I'm going to break this out into 3 episodes, with each topic area having its own episode. This episode will still include coffee chats, but the following 2 topics will be spaced out over 2 additional episodes. And the reason for that, besides the fact that this episode would be incredibly long if I include them all together, is that I actually want you to be able to reference back to each of these areas quite quickly. And I think it's important to recognize that there's going to be constant iteration of all of these topics. So what you might find is today you're listening to this topic and you might work on your resume walkthrough for a month. And then what you do is you come back to the episode, listen more so that you can refine and work on it in more detail. And I think this is really important to recognize that you're unlikely to have a perfect final version of anything in recruiting. In fact, you'll constantly change it, tweak it as long as you go. When I think back about my resume walkthrough, I probably told it hundreds of times, but I'll honestly say I don't ever know if I told it the same way twice. And the reason for that is depending on who you're talking to and the level they're at and what company, you might tweak the way you do some of these things. So you're going to have to keep them constantly varied. And I think it's important to recognize that and prepare for that. Now, before I jump into these episodes, I also want to give a little word of caution. What I'm going to talk about and the advice I'm going to give is just one way of viewing these 3 topics. This is in no means the only way to focus on any of these topics or work on them, but this is an example with an explanation on why I did them this way. Please remember that over the course of recruiting, you're going to get a ton of advice in the form of opinions. And you're going to have to ultimately decide if you want to utilize that information. But ultimately, you are the decision maker. If you don't like something, don't use it. If you do, then use it. The reason I'm doing these episodes is I believe it is extremely important early on not only to understand the role these 3 areas play, but to kind of show you an example of what it could look like so you can get started. I remember being super overwhelmed at the beginning of like, how do I get started? What could this even look like? What should I be doing? So I'm trying to provide you one way of doing that so that you can start to work on it. And ultimately, you're going to see what works well for you and what doesn't, and then you'll decide how to proceed forward. With that being said, I wanted to show you the way I apply my strategy to each of these 3 areas, but it may not work perfect for you. But the things that I do talk about, such as the concept of these 3 topic areas, the importance, and a good way to think about them, should be applicable to the way you tackle these 3 areas. Okay, let's talk coffee chats. I'm actually going to break this up into 5 sections. First, what is a coffee chat? Second, what role they play. Third, how to begin having coffee chats. Fourth, what I did as an example to you. And then fifth is just general tips. So section 1, what is a coffee chat? A coffee chat is essentially your way of networking in an MBA program. In fact, I would guess that about 90% of your networking is done through coffee chats, maybe more. And it's essentially just a one-on-one conversation with another individual. It could be anyone, fellow students, second years, alumni, employees, professors, anything could be considered a coffee chat. And the reason it's called a coffee chat is, in theory, you're sitting down for a one-on-one conversation, about 30 minutes long, with an individual grabbing coffee. Now, the coffee piece is really optional. In fact, most of your coffee chats will have nothing to do with coffee, especially because most of them will be virtual, or probably all of them will be virtual. So whether you have coffee or not really is relevant to the entire process. It took me a while to figure that out. Now, section 2, what role they play. And it's important to understand that coffee chats play different roles at different levels. So I'm talking about different levels of employees or individuals at an organization. And the best way to think about this is, for you, is coffee chats are the best way to gather information, get on the radar for interviews, network, and practice. And this 4th point, practice, is really important. You have to understand this is the best way to get real-time feedback on some of the things you're working on, such as your resume walkthrough, Also maybe your stories that you're working on and telling. It's actual, you can actually present them and kind of see body language and real-time feedback on how that's working. So it's a great time to practice those things. Now, on the flip side, what does a company use a coffee chat for? So the main thing is to get to know the talent better and to allow them to have another data point to narrow down their invite list for interviews. The other thing that they use it for is to get as many people interested in their company as possible, because it's in their best interest to have everybody from the school apply to that role, because then they can be more selective and they have more options of who they actually want to interview. So be aware of that. So a good way to think about this is it's a two-way street. As the values kind of adjust, so does the role of the coffee chat. And it's value to you. So what are you getting out of the coffee chat? And value to them, what are they getting out? And so I kind of break this out as second years and then kind of employees. And employees gets a little bit confusing, but for the most part, it remains solid. So second years, what you're getting is information gathering and practice. So what you're asking yourself is, how can I be successful recruiting in that industry and also in that company? These are things you're trying to get out of these coffee chats. Also, is this an industry interesting to me and should I pursue it further? You also want to practice your stories, engagement, your questions, all those things. And it's a really good time to get real-time feedback through body language or even just kind of vocal. And you can ask for feedback. I did every now and then to kind of understand, how is this resume walkthrough being perceived? Is it good? Especially with second use you feel comfortable with. And it's important to recognize that for second years, the value to you greatly outdoes the value to them. They're there to help you. In some circumstances, second years are involved in some capacity in the recruiting process for that company. They might kind of help funnel names to the company or things like that. But for the most part, they're not the final decision makers for who the company is going to invite to interview. So keep that in mind. They're part of the process, but also not the decision maker. Now, who is the decision maker? That's employees. So what your goal is for these coffee chats is to impress and also practice. This does not mean gathering information is not important, but you have to recognize the information you're gathering is going to be a little bit different. It's going to have more to do with what actually being at the job looks like and being successful at the job rather than the recruiting process, because a lot of these individuals might not be directly involved in recruiting, and they also might be many years out of doing it, so their information might not be perfectly relevant. So keep that in mind. And also when you even think about companies as a whole, as you start with newer employees, they're going to act a little bit more as gatekeepers, and as you move up, you might get to more experienced employees. So there's going to be less experienced employees, so they're going to kind of need that to be funneled. They're going to be a wealth of knowledge. If you have company-specific questions, they're great people to ask. And also the networking is super, super valuable for that. So keep that in mind. Step 3, how to begin having coffee chats, from setting one up to actually having one. And I'm going to talk about second years when I'm discussing this, because you should honestly not be having coffee chats with alumni right now. The reason that you shouldn't talk to alumni right now is that they're dealing with full-time recruiting, so that's their priority. Internship recruiting is secondary. When full-time is done, that's when internship recruiting becomes a priority. So you want to wait till then at the bare minimum. Second, you need practice. You don't want to go into a coffee chat with an alumni unprepared, because it's possible that you could mess that up and that could be detrimental to your recruiting effort. You also want to be top of mind when interview invites come out. Why would you have a coffee chat 5 months before you apply for a job with an alumni? They're probably going to forget who you are. And finally, second years have the information you need right now. So those are the people you should obviously be reaching out to, because that's just the most relevant for you in this situation. Alumni don't necessarily have that, are not going to be able to provide that information the same way. So stick to second years for right now. And the clubs will tell you when reaching out to alumni makes more sense. So just pay attention to that. So the 6 steps of setting up a coffee chat to actually having one. And what I'll say is that the clubs will go over this with you. Do default to what they say. If they say something different, do not listen to what I'm saying. They're going to be able to prepare you better for this than I am, because I'm kind of giving you a general idea of what this can look like. So step one, identify who you want to speak to. Obviously makes sense. You will get a list of where every second year interned, I would go through that list and kind of highlight every single person you're interested in setting a coffee chat up with. You can also look at LinkedIn and other previous connections. I would recommend the first couple of people you speak to, if possible, are people you have maybe emailed before or conversed with before, or somebody you feel comfortable with, because the first couple of coffee chats are going to kind of be rough. You just don't know what you're doing, and they can guide you through that and help you, and you won't really feel like you're being judged through that process. Second, for having a coffee chat, is do research on LinkedIn about who they are, understand their background, where they came from. This is really beneficial to bring up in a coffee chat to sound like you've actually done some research. Third, lay out your general questions. What information are you trying to get out of this coffee chat? You want to have that prepared on the front end, so you actually ensure you do it in the coffee chat. And this will evolve over time depending on who you speak to. Fourth, reaching out via email. This is actually how you're setting up the coffee chat. And this step's really important because you can kind of mess it up. The clubs will provide guidance on this. Listen to them, please. So what you'll do is you'll introduce yourself and explain why you're reaching out. Want to know more about, let's say, consulting. You will then go to that second year's Outlook calendar, and you will look for times that you are both available, that they overlap availability. You will then provide a few times to them that could work for both of you, and ask them to pick which time works best. When they reply and tell you what time, you will then reply to that with a calendar invite with a Zoom link or a phone number that they can contact you at. And if possible, it would be nice to put that in the subject, just because if they're on their phone, it's actually significantly easier to click that subject line than dive into the email, but that's probably less important. Now, the actual meeting, you're going to want to introduce yourself, thank them for their time. The most important thing, or one of the most important things to remember, is that you absolutely need paper and a pen to come to a coffee chat. I had a notebook that I use for every coffee chat. If you do not have this, it does look unprofessional, and it does look like you don't care because you're not writing anything down. And it's really beneficial to you to do this because you can reference back all this information over time. I used my coffee chat book a ton as I referenced back and thought about different things. So keep that in mind. So what you're going to do, essentially structure the conversation and move forward. What are your questions? What are you trying to accomplish? And move through that in an elegant manner. This is something you will get better and develop over time. Understand that. You will not be really good at the beginning, but that's fine. You'll talk with a bunch of second years, and before you speak to alumni, you'll be much more proficient at this. Final thing, follow up and thank them for their time in an email. So that's how you should essentially have coffee chats. Section 4, what I did as an example. During coffee chats, I was looking to a few things. First, drive the conversation, but allow it to flow. Also engage meaningfully, so be memorable and showcase who I was, and also get to know the other person on the side of the phone. If you're not genuine and authentic, it'll show. So make sure you actually are interested in having this conversation. Now, what did this look like for second years? I stuck to 4 basically broad questions that I asked every single second year. Now, they were very broad topics, and what I would do is I would ask follow-up questions and kind of dig down. But I wanted 4 key questions I was able to kind of reference and look at and compare what people were saying in different ways, so I can use that knowledge for myself. So the 4 questions I asked were, first, what was your experience at X company? So I'm not only asking their summer experience, but also recruiting. So I wanted to know, what do they do over the summer? Obviously super interesting to learn, but also, is there anything particular about this company I need to be aware of recruiting that might be different than other companies, so I know to prepare for that. Second, strategy through recruiting. How did you sell your background and get results? How did you make that happen? I think that's important. So I'm not going to directly say what was your strategy through recruiting necessarily, but I might say what was your background and how did you really, work that into consulting, for instance? How did you make that work? Third, What was your kind of differentiating factor that you used to separate yourself or really make yourself stand out and be unique? And what worked and what didn't work. So if you tried a bunch of things, what did you find stand out and worked? And for consulting, this is really part of the why consulting question because you really want to sell your background to that. So I was really trying to understand what elements they used, so maybe I can think about some of those for myself. And the final question was, what did you do for prep for behavioral and casing? This is consulting specific. Whatever your interviews are like, you'll ask that as well, potentially. And I'm just trying to make sure I get a broad understanding of what I need to do to be prepared. Now, the final thing I would always do in a coffee chat is ask for feedback and or tips to go forward. Everybody is going to be happy to provide you tips. People want to help you, especially alumni or second years. They have a vested interest in your success. Keep that in mind. Do not finish the coffee chat without asking for any advice. The other thing that I think you should always include in a coffee chat is your resume walkthrough. You should always start off the coffee chat telling the other person about you. You want them to have a vested interest in who you are. If you never tell the other person anything about you, how are they going to know if they want you to work for their company or not? So you do want to make it a two-sided conversation. On top of that, you need to practice your resume walkthrough as many times as possible. And coffee chats are a great way to do that. So keep that in the back of your mind. When you're getting to alumni and employees, you're going to use the information you gathered from second years and recent alumni to ask more detailed questions and showcase your knowledge. So you're not going to stick to the 4 questions I just laid out. They're going to be a lot different because you're talking to a bunch of different people, and you're going to have much more specific questions of what you're looking for. Don't focus on this now. The clubs will kind of help you. You'll have a better idea of what this can look like after you've had a bunch of coffee chats with second years. But in essence, the questions are going to be more geared towards the company or their experience more specifically. So keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so section 5, the final section of this, is tips. Preparation is key. Do some due diligence before you enter a coffee chat so you know who you're talking to, what might be good questions, and show that you are prepared for this. No one is obligated to speak to you. I don't have to speak to anyone who reaches out to me. I'm choosing to do so because I want to help you. So make sure it's worth their time, and also make sure it's worth your time. If you're not prepared, you're not going to ask good questions and get the information you need out of this person. So do that on the front end. Always do a resume walkthrough, as I just talked about. It's very, very important. Timing is important. I kind of touched upon that very early, but you want to time some of your coffee chats closer to, and you want to space them out, obviously, but you want to time them in a way that you're top of mind when companies are deciding who they want to actually invite to interview. So think about that as you go along. You want to be top of mind when that happens, when that comes around. Always end asking for any advice, kind of said that. Goal is a conversation, not just a Q&A. You're not grilling them with questions. You want to have a really nice conversation. Those are going to be the best coffee chats. They're also going to be the most memorable for the employee and the alumni, which means that the likelihood of it being successful is much better. Practicing this is also really good for interviews as well, because you do want to make it a conversational interview. Another thing, and kind of the last thing to consider, is there is a lot of variation within coffee chats, depending on the individual, the company, or the industry. As always, through this entire web series, consult your second years in the industry and the companies you're interested in on the best way to go about doing these things. They're going to have the most relevant information. So that's it for coffee chats.